Hello and welcome back to Japan Memo, the IISS Japan Chair Programme podcast. I'm Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy here at the IISS. Here we're joined by experts, strategists and practitioners to analyse why Japan matters in today's regional and global geopolitical landscape. Today we're excited to welcome three wonderful guests, Professor Iwama Yoko, Professor Guibourg Delamotte and Dr. Alexandra Sakaki, to discuss Japan-EU relations. First, some introductions. Iwama Yoko is a professor at Japan's National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, which is known as GRIPS. She's also the director at the Security and Strategy Programme, SSP, at GRIPS. Her speciality is international security and European diplomatic history, centering on NATO, Germany, and nuclear strategy. Yoko has also served on numerous Japanese government committees. Among her recent publications are two works in Japanese, translated into English as the 1968 Global Nuclear Order in West Germany, for which she received the 2022 Inoki Masamichi Prize of the Japan Society for Security Studies. The other is The Realities of Nuclear Sharing, NATO's Experience and Japan, which was published in 2023. Welcome, Yoko.
Thank you.
And then Professor Guibourg Delamotte. Guibourg is a tenured full professor of political science at the Japanese Studies Department of the French Institute of Oriental Studies, Inalco, which she heads, and research fellow at the French Research Institute on East Asia. Guibourg's speciality is Japan's foreign and security policies and Japanese domestic politics. She's also senior visiting research fellow with the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology, known as RCAST, at the University of Tokyo. And she's Distinguished Research Fellow of the Japan Forum on International Relations and Academic Fellow at the Institute for Contemporary Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan. Among Guibourg's recent publications are two in French, Le Japon, leader discret, published in 2023, and La démocratie au Japon, singulière et universelle, published in 2022. Welcome, Guibourg.
Thank you.
And Dr. Alexandra Sakaki, Deputy Head of the Asia Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs at Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, known as SWP, which is an independent foreign policy think tank in Berlin. Alexandra's research focuses on Japanese foreign and security policy, as well as Indo-Pacific security dynamics. Previously, she was a visiting researcher at Keio University in Japan and the National Defense Academy, also in Japan. Alexandra has authored numerous policy papers as well as articles in learned journals and elsewhere. Among her recent publications is a book chapter on Germany's Indo-Pacific policy, published in an edited volume called Transformation of the Liberal International Order, as well as an SWP research paper called Dealing with Taiwan. Welcome, Alexandra.
Thank you.
To set the scene, let's start with Europe's approach to the Indo-Pacific. In 2016, then Prime Minister Abe Shinzo articulated a vision for Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Concept, or FOIP, highlighting the strategic importance of the convergence of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. One important driver for creating this specifically Indo-Pacific framework was to encourage more partners of Japan, especially those in Europe, to engage in the region in the face of growing Chinese assertiveness and uncertain American commitment. Some 80% of the goods entering the European continent transit through the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So the security of transit routes, the freedom of navigation, the rule of law, all of which feature in FOIP, of course, are vital for all European states. Since 2016, the EU has itself been tilting towards the Indo-Pacific. And in 2021, the EU launched its first Indo-Pacific strategy, which was updated in 2024, earlier this year. But one of the biggest concerns with the EU's approach to the Indo-Pacific region is the lack of a common understanding about the region and about priorities and strategies among the member states. France, Germany, and the Netherlands all have different geographical definitions of the Indo-Pacific, for example. So first question to Yoko, Guibourg, and Alexandra. What do you think are the strengths and the weaknesses of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the EU? Start with you, please, Yoko.
As you just said, every member country has a different stance to Indo-Pacific. What comes out in any strategic document is the very minimum of common understanding that you can reach amongst these states. This is very much about China. I mean, it's not an encircling alliance against China, but it is a way of trying to deal with the challenge that Chinese are posing to us in the wider Indo-Pacific region, and how we try to enhance rule of law and fair competition in the region. Every state has a different distance to China and to the countries in the region. With so many countries, you have so many different positions. Therefore, what comes out of it is very often not a very exciting or interesting document. I guess that's the weakness. We welcome that there's a awareness in Europe that this region exists. We need to engage in it. And so any signs of this positive engagement is welcome to us. That's the general response that you would get from a Japanese.
Guibourg Yoko said Japan welcomes the awareness in Europe that the region exists. What about the strengths and weaknesses for you of the EU's approach?
The EU's approach to the Indo-Pacific had to be inclusive because different states had different opinions. The way they addressed that issue, they make it appear as inclusive, but they stressed that they'll be cooperating with states which already have an Indo-Pacific strategy, which is a bit of a code word to say that indeed this excludes China. Although China does have to deal with the two oceans as well. The Indo-Pacific has very much become indeed this expression in a way which stresses the fact that democracies want to work together so as to contain China. I think it was a great progress that the EU is able to come up with a strategy at all. The change of position in the EU's approach to China can be dated back, I believe, to the 2019 Indo-China Outlook document, which was really quite strongly worded, although it was a balanced approach again, but which stressed the fact that we had a systemic competitor before us. The EU strategy has 7 pillars, which I find well chosen because they really are extensions of the internal policies of the EU. So they appear as within the possible reach of the EU and also make it legitimate for the EU to deal with those issues like climate change or a green transition or issues like that. It also has an important mention of issues like ocean governance or security and defense, for which the EU will rely on member state capabilities as it does already. And so this is mentioned. And indeed, so we'll get back to that, to what France, the UK and Germany do in the Indo-Pacific. That is helpful to the EU's strategy and backset, but it's not directly the EU, of course. So these are the limitations of the EU. The EU cannot do everything. And then also the other thing which I found interesting in the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy is that it makes a lot of room for Japan. Japan appears in nearly all of the pillars, I believe all of the pillars actually. The Japan-EU Connectivity Initiative, that's very strong. There's also the first data protection agreement, which makes it the widest protection area in the world, and possible cooperation on issues with Taiwan as well. So trade is a big aspect of the Indo-Pacific strategy, but Taiwan appears on several occasions. And this too is a sign that the EU is willing to cooperate with Taiwan in a way that is not overly antagonizing to China, I believe. It does parallel actually France's position and Japan's position of backing Taiwan's membership of international organizations.
Just for those of our listeners that don't know these 7 pillars, I think you talked about them in what you said. Would you mind just listing them briefly out so that we have them in our minds?
Yes, so they are sustainable and inclusive prosperity. So that in essence is trade. Then there's green transition. And on the green transition, the European Commission has just adopted a plan. I mean, it's recently been finalized to become a law at the end of 2024 to curb EU-driven deforestation, for instance. So that's one example of green transition in action there. Ocean governance, digital governance and partnerships, connectivity, on which it's been working with Japan as well, security and defense, and human security, which is the last of the pillars.
Thank you. Alexandra, strengths and weaknesses of EU Indo-Pacific policy.
Thanks, Robert. One of the weaknesses that is often criticized in the Indo-Pacific strategy of the EU, and also actually with regards to the German Indo-Pacific guidelines, is that they're quite wide-ranging in terms of topics, as we just heard. And therefore, there's a lack of clarity of role or purpose. It becomes more difficult to discern specifically the goals and objectives. I think that's actually a criticism that is difficult to sustain if we look at other Indo-Pacific strategies, including, for example, South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy or Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific approach. Those are also quite wide-ranging in terms of topic. And also, as we just heard, those are topics that are really important for the Indo-Pacific region as a whole. What's more important about the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy is that it was really a milestone in terms of getting discussions going in Europe on how the Indo-Pacific is important to Europe, where the interconnections are, And it's also been important in terms of channeling resources and also political attention to the region since then. So I think it's really a milestone, even if it may sometimes lack some clarity. At the core, though, I think the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy is actually quite similar to Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific approach. I think it really revolves around the interest in promoting a rules-based international order that is revolving around multilateral cooperation in the region and also deepening engagement with various partners in the region. So I think there's a lot of commonality between the two approaches.
Alexandra mentioned resources, and of course that's key for all countries' policies, domestically and foreign policy, obviously. In Europe's case, clearly there's the biggest war in Europe since the end of the Second World War, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine now. Thinking about bandwidth and resources, how do you feel that, given the constraints now on Europe's strategic bandwidth, largely because of what's going on in Ukraine, how sustainable do you feel that this Indo-Pacific tilt of the EU and Europe, how sustainable do you think it is? Japan in particular is concerned about whether European interest in the Indo-Pacific will stray and wane because of the issues in the east of the continent. So do you think that Japan should be concerned about the sustainability of Europe's Indo-Pacific involvement? So Europe and, of course, the EU taken together. Guibourg, perhaps you first.
I don't think that is likely to happen because the Indo-Pacific is too important for France's sovereign interests. France really does have 1.6 million of its citizens over there in the Indo-Pacific. It does have about 8,000 officers or military personnel, in any case, permanently deployed over there. So a real permanent maritime and military presence over there in 3 sovereign commands and 2 that are not sovereignty related, but that are nevertheless, important presences in the important bases in Djibouti and the United Arab Emirates. We're present in 5 different spots in the Indo-Pacific. That displays, the importance the Indo-Pacific has for France's defense strategy as a whole, national security strategy. And given the role France played in bringing about the Indo-Pacific strategy, given the impulse it showed, its ability to really mobilize in that favor during its presidency in 2022, I don't think it is likely that because of the war in Ukraine, anything would change vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific. However, the question comes to a large extent, I believe, to President Macron's ambivalence, what appears as ambivalence. This strategy of aiming for strategic balancing, i.e. sort of rejecting the bloc strategy. That's the idea, no blocks, so therefore we're in between. We appear as an alternative, an additional choice for any partner in the region. I think that creates ambiguity and is misunderstood in Japan, and rightly so, because de facto the French are on the US side. De facto, they're talking to the Chinese and creating and signaling in a way that's detrimental to NATO and to the allies in the Pacific. And so they're in between, which means they're alienating their allies and yet not becoming friendlier, really, or more influential on Russia or China. So I think they're really losing both ways. The messaging has created that misunderstanding on the Japanese side. For the French, there's no doubt that they are committed to the 2 regions, and there's no linkage really being established between the 2 regions, which is why President Macron didn't want a NATO liaison office in Tokyo. He doesn't want to establish a linkage. The flip side of that is that he considers the 2 areas that are absolutely essential. The war in Ukraine is seen as a most urgent question, a most pressing question for Europe at the moment, but it doesn't mean that anything would change because of that war. Vis-a-vis engagement in the Indo-Pacific. If anything, the naval presence is stronger than it's ever been. There's going to be, again, a naval deployment, and there has been since 2021 to the South Pacific from July. And that will see the French with the Germans and Spaniards and the UK, actually. So first, the French will fly down with the Germans and Spaniards. That's the future combat air system partners. And then the French will meet up with the British over there. This is because, they're partners. They have a non-permanent operational cooperation, which is called the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force. So the 2 partners will meet down there. So this is really, if anything, to show how united Europeans are and committed they are to the Indo-Pacific. So I don't see that wavering at all. And in fact, really, the Indo-Pacific is very much about naval deployment, which is why there is talk of naval deployment coordination between the French and the British. This would not be the primary dimension of any intervention in Ukraine. President Macron's been talking about troop deployment. He's not followed, as you've have noticed. Missile defense would be something that would be very much needed for the Ukrainians. So I'm not sure. I don't think the primary dimension would be the naval one.
Alexandra, you're sitting in Berlin today. How do you feel that Germany views the sustainability of Europe's Indo-Pacific commitment?
Well, I very much agree with what was just said, and I want to underline some of the things. The war in Ukraine, as well as we have the Gaza conflict as well, that has prompted Europeans to focus much more on their neighborhood, and territorial defense is a big issue now. I think there can be little doubt about how apprehensive Europeans are about those conflicts and how those conflicts will impact European security for years to come. But on the other hand, I think the EU and also some of the member states, like Germany, for example, have really made an effort to show that their Indo-Pacific engagement continues despite those conflicts. And I think a good example is the German Indo-Pacific deployment this year. It's going to be Germany's biggest deployment to the Indo-Pacific, with a frigate, a support ship, and also Eurofighters and other airplanes going to the region in the coming months, despite the fact that NATO's eastern flank obviously also requires a lot of military assets. This engagement with the Indo-Pacific, the Russian war, I think, has really reinforced the imperative that we engage with the Indo-Pacific for two reasons, I think. One is that it has highlighted the deep interconnections between Europe and Asia. If we think about China's support to Russia, North Korea's supply of munitions and other military equipment to Russia, and also, importantly, of course, Japan's key role in enforcing sanctions on Russia. So I think these interconnections have become quite clear through that. And secondly, I think the war in Ukraine has been a wake-up call, not just to Japan, but also to Europeans about the risks of military conflict also emerging in the Indo-Pacific, and we cannot let down our guard regarding those risks. So I think in that sense, the Russian war in Ukraine has strengthened the resolve of Europeans in some ways to actually engage with the Indo-Pacific.
A question for Yoko. I was struck by what Alexandra just said about the strategic links between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. I was also struck by what Guibourg said about President Macron not wanting the linkages between these two regions. For Japan, the famous comment by Prime Minister Kishida that Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow, which I thought was a really important strategic insight. What can Japan do to support the sustainability of European interest in the Indo-Pacific? President Macron and others know that the Indo-Pacific is vitally important, but there's a sort of difference, I think, in approach here. Can Japan do anything to keep this on track?
I'm very glad that you brought up the message from Prime Minister Kishida today's Ukraine could be tomorrow's East Asia. We in Japan are very aware of it. We are also very much worried about how this war has pushed Russia, China, and now North Korea closer together. And I think we should have no illusions about that. One thing we're concerned about when it comes to messages coming out from especially President Macron and Chancellor Scholz, that they seem to still count on the possibility that somehow they can persuade the Chinese to be the mediator of solving this conflict. In reality, they are already very much part of the conflict. They may come when China would play a very important role in solving the conflict, but I think we shouldn't have too much illusions about that. Well, what we can do is trying to persuade the Europeans about the seriousness of the situation and how the whole capacity of Chinese, North Korean, and Russian ammunition building and war fighting are coming together. And that is a problem for all of us, including the United States. And in this war, additionally, you see also a lot of civilian capabilities that are dual use going into the war fighting. And China, without doubt, has the world's largest capacity of producing such things. All in all, I think the West, if I could use that expression, needs to really double its effort to prepare for a period where you might actually have a lot of war fighting on multiple fronts going on. We're still, all of us, are sort of still in a very peacetime mode when it comes to ammunition production and so on. It's only very few countries like Finland and Poland who has really woken up to what is necessary today. Both Europe and Japan needs to really share its perspectives on what's happening. How long do we need to be in this effort? And how should we be assisting each other? It's not from one way to the other. I think we really need to combine our effort and look at who has what capacity and how best to allocate our resources. The EU has been long trying to do this with some success, not a huge success, but with some success. But I think that needs to happen on a much wider scale, including the partners in Indo-Pacific, like Australians, Japanese, and Koreans.
Guibourg.
In my view, Japan's really been doing quite a lot to stress the importance of the Indo-Pacific. Really, Japan is the country that put the Indo-Pacific on the international agenda, made the phrase, Indo-Pacific, the expression, commonly used piece of international language that adopted the first Indo-Pacific strategy, also gave it its attributes, to be free and open, and also its content from the international law aspect to connectivity, to quality infrastructures. All that has been Japan's doing. And then creating all those bonds, really, amongst like-minded countries, Australia, the United Kingdom, but also the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia. So Japan's been tremendously active. What I see is really a failure on the part specifically of I think the EU's been very responsive to Japan's initiatives. Charles Michel seems to have got along very well with Abe Shinzo. President Macron, he saw Prime Minister Kishida early May, and then President Xi was in Paris as well. There seems to be a lack of willingness to engage fully with Japan, because that would mean stepping away from China. And I think really that's something President Macron does not want to do. He comes across as being quite naive with China, the same way that he was in the early stages of the war in Ukraine, if you'll remember, when he was trying to talk to Putin face to face and hoping to influence him. He's got this great, surprising faith in his own ability to convince authoritarian leaders. And so when Xi was in Paris, he said France welcomed the commitment made a year ago and reiterated again early May by Xi Jinping to stop selling weapons to Moscow and its commitment to strictly control the export of dual-use goods. So that's a commitment President Macron welcomed again May the 6th, but that had been made a year ago. To what extent can you keep on trusting? What more can Japan do in that context? I really wonder, frankly.
Let's look a bit more closely at EU's relationship with China. And Yoko said at the beginning that the Indo-Pacific policy is very much about China. China is opposed to the sort of Indo-Pacific framework, which it views as a framework to build an anti-China coalition. EU, meanwhile, has defined China as, a quote, partner, competitor, and systemic rival. President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she's adopted a hard stance towards Beijing and highlighted the need for Europe to actively minimize risk in its interactions with China, introducing the particularly softer term of de-risking, which stands in counterpart to the US's harder-edged decoupling. Attitudes into China within individual member states, as we've been discussing, they also vary widely. Many countries in Central Eastern Europe, they participate in China's Belt and Road Initiative. They don't have an interest at all in antagonizing China. Hungary's tilt towards China has been particularly striking. And then Western Europe, as we've been discussing, has an ambivalent attitude towards China, reflecting varying commercial and political priorities. So, Alexandra, Chancellor Scholz was in Beijing quite recently, and clearly Germany has particularly strong economic links with China. How do you think China's growing footprint in the European continent impacts the EU's collective strategy towards the Indo-Pacific?
You're right in observing that there's different views on China within the EU among member states. As a general trend, I think it's fair to say that China's decision to extend significant support politically and economically to Russia in the context of the war on Ukraine, I think has functioned as a catalyst in European thinking on China. Most Europeans now are much clearer that competition and rivalry are really the defining aspects of our relations with China, even if we still seek some level of cooperation with China, and we also seek to maintain some level of political dialogue and political channels with China. The Russian invasion has also underlined the risk of excessive dependencies on such powerful authoritarian countries. That being said, I think views on China are kind of progressing. And among member states, I think there's varying shades of gray, if you will. For example, if you take Germany, I think there's no doubt that Germany has very considerable economic interests in China that it's aware of. China was Germany's most important trading partner in 2023. German companies have also invested much in China. So there's no doubt in my mind that the German government is very mindful about how those economic interests might be impacted by various policies. And I think a good example of that is the EU's investigation into anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese electric vehicle manufacturing. The German government and also the German car industry has been very skeptical about this process because they fear retaliation. This shows those economic interests are, of course, important. And I think that is a general observation we can make about different European member states, that they all have their particular interests with regard to China. And in some sense, that means that European messages on China may sometimes seem a bit muddled. But on the other hand, I think there's really strong consensus in Europe on the engagement part of other Indo-Pacific partners, regardless of how China thinks about that. So I think there's a strong consensus, and that's where we're willing to go forward. The only exception is perhaps Taiwan, I think. Europeans are not all on the same line on how far we want to go with engagement on Taiwan, given that China is very watchful on that aspect.
Could you remind us of where Germany sits on the Taiwan issue?
In recent years, I would say, especially last year, Germany, seeing the extensive tensions around Taiwan, was becoming more active. We saw a lot of delegations from Germany going to Taiwan. There was a lot more political dialogue. On the other hand, I think now there's some reconsideration on exactly how far we're going on. So I think there's really concern of how China might be reacting, how the new government in Taiwan might act, and how that might increase tensions in the Taiwan Strait. So I think at the moment, people are waiting a bit and seeing how that is developing.
And Guibourg, could you give us a view from France on how France looks at China's growing footprint in Europe and the implications thereof?
It might be useful, yes, reminding listeners France's position. It's quite on Taiwan. Again, it's very ambivalent because in April 2023, President Macron was in China. The only thing that came out in the joint statement between Xi and Macron was that France supported the One China policy, and no mention of what Japan usually likes to see in such statements, which is belief and the emphasis on a peaceful solution to cross-strait issues. So when Macron, however, met President Xi again, he did not mention Taiwan early May, did not talk about Taiwan at all. There's not one mention of Taiwan. In fact, there's not one mention of the Indo-Pacific in any of the declarations between Mr. Macron and Mr. Xi taken early May this year. But when just a few days before President Macron met with Prime Minister Kishida, he did say, because it's important for the Japanese to hear it again, so he did re-emphasize the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and how the two countries' position on Taiwan remained unchanged. This is what comes out of the Japan-France roadmap, which was adopted during Prime Minister Kishida's visit, although it had been drafted a few months before. And really, in a sense, you can consider everything as reconcilable, of course, because the whole position on Taiwan, everybody's position on Taiwan is a bit ambiguous, ambivalent. But you can see how, depending on who you talk to, who President Macron talks to, whether President Xi or Prime Minister Kishida, he'll emphasize one aspect of the question or the other. When he came back from that trip to China in April 2023, what had caused controversy was that on the return journey, he'd given an interview to journalists. We're not quite sure if it was intended to be an interview, to be fair, in which he said that Europe should not let itself be dragged into other countries' wars. So that seemed to hint, in the context of a visit to China, that France would not want to intervene in any kind of Taiwan contingency. And naturally, the messaging was very unfortunate because no state is very clear on what they would do in the case of a Taiwan contingency, but every state is very cautious not to stress that they wouldn't do anything, which is what President Macron seemed to be doing. So, we've got that very, very ambivalent positioning again.
Yoko, I can see you nodding there. Would you like to add something?
Nobody wants a war over Taiwan. Although today the Chinese, I think its naval forces, are doing an exercise around Taiwan Island, but nobody, including China for that matter, I believe, wants a war over Taiwan. But everybody is committed in a different way. Japan, the most important thing is stability. We are not committed to join the war if there is a Taiwan contingency. That's not written anywhere. It remains to the Americans to decide what they would do in case of a Taiwan contingency. But we are all in this boat that we do not want a war over Taiwan Strait for various reasons. And Taiwan is such an important part of world economy, produces over 90% of world high-end semiconductor. It's different from us sanctioning Russia. Just think about sanctioning China. It's going to disrupt the world economy. That's just incomparable to sanctions against Russia. None of us wants that. I mean, Japan is also very dependent on Chinese market for its economic growth. We are just recovering from COVID shocks through Chinese tourists starting to pour into our land. All in all, what we want is just peace. You need to be committed in order to maintain this peace. That's what I tell always to the Europeans, that we're not asking them to come and fight at the Taiwan Strait. We're not asking them to send ships and guns the moment there's an instability or crisis. We are only asking for a firm political commitment that the change of status quo by force is quite unacceptable, and it will have political and economic consequences, and for that matter, very serious consequences. That is what we want them to do, to show a clear political commitment. Personally, I think we failed in deterrence when Russia attacked Ukraine. If Russians were given enough warning how strong the Ukrainian armed forces would be, and to what extent we would go in supporting these armed forces, they would have thought twice and three times before attacking Ukraine. Obviously, Putin thought that his war would go much easier, and it wasn't the case. And so we shouldn't give Beijing the illusion that somehow he can steal the day and go across the Taiwan Strait and everybody would wake up and say, geez, that was quick, and do nothing. The way Macron behaved in Beijing did not help. We would have wanted him to give a lot more clearer message. But again, that does not include us asking the Europeans to send their armed forces to Taiwan Strait. Although we are in a lot of naval exercise, this year and next year, we're not counting on them to appear as soon as there's a guns sounding in the strait. And for that matter, a lot will depend on the Americans. When they are resolved, then we are 100% behind them. But we cannot fight alone without the Americans. That's a totally different, undecided scenario, what will happen if a war breaks out. And all we want to do is maintain stability, deter anyone from taking these reactions.
Developing the point on Taiwan and deterrence and defense cooperation, what are the challenges, do you think, for enhanced defense cooperation between Japan, the EU, and Europe more broadly?
There's a need really for joint effort between US and all the other Western partners, including the EU, Japan, Korea, Australia. Concerning Japan, the biggest problem is that we had been for decades very inward looking. Defense industry in Japan is exclusively oriented towards producing what our self-defense force needs. And for a long time, we had not thought about exporting any of this. And this is a hurdle when we want to co-produce weapons and munitions. And we're currently in a project to produce a fighter jet with British and Italians. But there's a lot of legal obstacles that we need to overcome before everything's running smoothly. Another episode was the Australian submarines, where the French first got the contract, but it didn't work out. And now the British and the Americans are going to help the Australians produce atomic propelled submarines. Japan only thinks about exporting finished products, which is produced 100% inside Japan. But very often partner countries want part of production in their country, part of the techniques and works coming down on their soil. I think we really need to change the way we think, especially the defense industry, how they produce. There's really a need for rethink here. But again, Europeans have so long been used to doing things inside Europe. There again, there's a space for change and expansion, I think.
Alexandra.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I also observe the fact that kind of the mindset can be a challenge in European, Japanese, especially in the defense industrial cooperation area. I've observed between Germany and Japan some level of interest in some kind of cooperation in this field, either buying equipment from each other or perhaps even engaging in a bilateral or multilateral development project. Germany, for example, has been long focused on France as the key partner in all development. As we just heard, Japan is very much focused on the US for long. Both sides can really develop their potential and relations if they make a strategic decision to cooperate more in this field, because I think the defense industrial field has broader impact on security relations. It can establish more trust in bilateral relations. It can move a lot of dialogues forward. So I think this is really a promising area, even if it means that both sides have to overcome the challenge of facing their mindset in this field. Another challenge, if we look at the EU, I think a perennial challenge in EU foreign and security policy making is that it is impeded by the requirement of unanimous decision making. The EU cannot act in all fields. Naval assets are a good example. They're national naval assets. So the EU cannot decide to send naval assets to the Indo-Pacific. It has to be member states. On the other hand, I think we should look probably at the engagement by the EU and also by member states with the Indo-Pacific as complementary. Both member states and the EU can play on their advantages, relative advantages in engaging the Indo-Pacific. The EU, for example, obviously can leverage much bigger financial resources in its engagement with the Indo-Pacific. Member states may be able to decide quicker on certain policies. So there's different advantages, and I think it's complementary in that sense that both can be used, but it also means for a country like Japan or other Indo-Pacific countries, it also means that they have to continue engaging both with the EU level and individual member states.
Guibourg.
I completely agree. I mean, I think, the EU member states can do force projection, whereas the EU itself can be more about, capacity building or counter-terrorism or cyber security, maritime security, crisis management, fighting against illegal fisheries, that kind of thing. Countries like France, they're involved in something called the Pacific Quad, which is really interesting with Australia, the US, and they patrol for 170 days per year, the South Pacific, the island states, who do not have maritime capabilities. And so they're on board, their officials, those states' officials are on board, and they can do the policing themselves. This is the kind of initiative, it's not really EU, it's member state plus because it's an international corporation, but it's extremely helpful. Multi-frame thinking is what we require.
Let's turn to economic security, because this is an area that has seen, I think, quite a lot of activity between Japan and the EU. The EU released a package of measures on economic security in 2023, which has since been updated. The EU's strategy looks a little bit like Japan's, which was enacted in 2022, with its 4 pillars: supply chain resilience, critical infrastructure, development and security of critical products, as well as technologies and patent security. And recent developments between Japan and the EU include a memorandum of cooperation on hydrogen from 2022, a memorandum of cooperation on semiconductors on 2023. At the bilateral level, Japan and France have also agreed to work together to build a robust supply network for key minerals needed for electric vehicles, for which both countries are highly dependent on China for specific items. So a question to all three of you: how does the similarity between the EU's and Japan's economic security strategies reflect their expectations for future cooperation? And do you see this future cooperation being smooth? Yoko, can I start with you, please?
Yes, economic security is easily said than done. You can write a lot of strategies on paper. Implementing is very complicated and difficult. I think you would never sort of achieve 100% what you want. There's two directions in economic security. One is disrupting the other side from getting what we do not want them to get. And then the other side would be making ourselves less dependent on sources that may be disrupted on certain occasions. And both is very difficult to control. There have been lots of legislations going on, especially in Japan. But as I said earlier, a lot of technology used in warfighting today is still use. I mean, look at the drones, and some of the parts are things that you will easily find in Akihabara. It's not possible to control that completely. Part of it is simply messaging, part of it is slowing down the process. But on the other hand, I think we really need to be serious about making ourselves less dependent on sources that may complicate our economy and our effort. There, I think we can work together seriously with Europe, and that really will involve Indo-Pacific. That brings us back there. Neither Europe nor Japan are resource producing countries, so we are import dependent on other places. We also need to diversify our sources, so there's a lot to be discussed and talked about, I think.
Alexandra.
I think there is great convergence in the economic security approaches between Japan and Europe. And perhaps that's not surprising because I think Japan was really a source of inspiration for Europeans. I can certainly say that for Germany as well. So we're looking to how Japan is approaching different instruments. If I look at Europe, it seems to me that the discussions is also progressing from initially a focus on more defensive instruments like the investment screening or anti-coercion instruments. And now we're talking more about enhancing the competitiveness of European industries that are operating in strategic sectors. So this is quite close to where Japan is also talking about strategic indispensability, developing critical technologies, etc., which raises to me the question really of, can we not, between Japan and Europe, work more closely together on technological advancements? I think this has a lot of potential if we put together our joint resources in that. And another key feature I think that's important to keep in mind is that both Japan and Europe really emphasize the need to uphold multilateral rules in the economic field, even as we pursue these economic security policies. So I think that's quite important. And of course, the Europeans implemented actually a lot of their economic security policies with a look at US tariffs as well. So that was also a major concern for Europeans. Beyond that, I think where we can work together more, I think the devil is in the details when we look at economic security policy. So we can talk about broad policy instruments and broad objectives, but if we look specifically at how do we assess risks, how do we define critical materials, etc., how willing are we to go along with certain instruments that the US is proposing, like outward investment screening? Japan and Europe have a lot to talk about and to try to find common positions on those issues.
You're saying, Alexandra, that the EU and Japan find it easier to align on economic security policy than perhaps EU and the US and Japan and the US?
It's my impression, yes, especially when it comes to finding a level playing field. I think that's a common objective by both Japan and Europe. both the Japanese and the European economic security policies are country agnostic. So they're not targeting specifically China. As I said, the US was also a major concern for Europeans. So I think this is a common policy view in both Japan and Europe, yes.
And Guibourg, economic security, EU and Japan.
Economic security is a complicated thing, as Iwama Sensei was suggesting. I think altering supply chains that have been built for about 20, 30 years now is not easily done. And sometimes they're just being diverted. But as far as really technological cooperation goes between the EU and Japan, I do think, as was being said by Alexandra, that it should be very possible for the two blocs to cooperate. Although France-German cooperation is difficult enough, it would seem integrating another party might be even more of a challenge. The Japanese really need that very, very solid sort of ideological or political consistency, which they find in the UK and they don't see it in France, and very rightly so, because again, the French mentioned cooperation on electronic cars with Japan. They did the same with the Chinese, again, that May visit. So cooperation on batteries, electric vehicles, technological solutions, innovation platforms. So, there's this idea that everything can be reconciled, and the Japanese just don't see it that way. So, to what extent can technological cooperation with the French can go further? I don't know. And then if the French are not included in EU cooperation, then maybe with the Germans, but that might make it a bilateral cooperation more than a European one. It is difficult, isn't it? In any case, if you look at the EU on a whole, it seems to have gone much closer to Japan than was previously the case. And it would seem that the Chinese see France as relatively open-minded to cooperation and all that, and the EU is relatively close. They themselves don't really know what to make of the French discourse, it would seem.
As a coda to that, you mentioned the UK. We haven't really talked much about the UK. You made an interesting point about Japan and the UK finding it easier to cooperate than perhaps Japan and France. Could you flesh that out a bit, please?
Yes, technological cooperation, industrial cooperation was actually supposed to start more or less at the same time as defense cooperation, intelligence cooperation was launched at the end of 2011 to at the beginning of 2012 between the UK and Japan on the one side and France and Japan on the other. The Japanese really started the two more or less at the same time. The cooperation with the UK from the start was sort of more industrial, whereas cooperation and dialogue with the French was supposed to be a little bit more strategic discussions and that kind of thing. So cooperation with the UK went further. The UK started discussing missile cooperation with Japan, and that did not work. But now the big project is the joint fighter, of course. And aside from that, and the reason why this massive project for Japan was possible is that it was made possible. And the reason why cooperation would be considered with the UK to such a degree was that really the UK knows on what side it stands on the international scene. So it's on the US's side, it's created AUKUS. So, there's that consistency in the political discourse. There's none of that sort of in-betweenness that the French sort of seem to be embodying at the moment.
That brings us to our final questions, our Japan memo questions, which we ask all of our guests on all of our shows. And we've had some fantastic answers. So I'm very much looking forward to your answers. 2 questions. Do you have a book or recommendation of books for listeners who wish to understand Japan better? And you are allowed to recommend your own books, so feel free to do so. And the second question is, what do you think people often get wrong about Japan? Alexandra, perhaps if we can start from you, please.
Sure. I think my favorite book of recent is Michael Green's book, Line of Advantage, because I think he does a fabulous job in explaining how Japan has been adjusting its foreign policy to the challenges, and also how Japan is pivotal in many issues, including in the Indo-Pacific. That book has one shortcoming, though, and that is that it doesn't look really at Japan's relations with Europe. So for those listeners who, after today's podcast, are interested in Japan-Europe relations, well, there's not a whole lot of literature actually on this, but I do have 2 recommendations. One is an edited volume, which is called Alliances in Asia and Europe, the Evolving Indo-Pacific Strategic Context and Interregional Alignments. It's not specifically only focused on Japan-Europe relations, but the book, I think, provides a lot of relevant context to understand the bilateral relationship. And another one is a report by Jeff Fornong at RAND, Allies Growing Closer, published already in 2020, but I think it provides a really good resource to understand the background of security and defense cooperation between Japan and Europe. And things are moving forward, of course, but it provides a lot of background.
And what do you think people get wrong about Japan?
I think I'm not the first to say this in this podcast, but what I see most frequently when I look at German media reporting or international media reporting on Japan is that Japan's security policy is often put into the two categories of either pacifist or militarizing. And I think those categories don't really adequately describe Japan's path in security and defense policy. I think there's always been a strand of idealism in Japanese security policy making, but also a strand of realism. And I think we have to recognize that. I think the more interesting shift that we touched upon today as well is that Japan has moved from a position where it was exclusively focused on the US in its foreign policy making to really a country that is engaged with so many countries around the world, including Europe, which, relations with Europe were long dominated by economics, and now relations have developed so far. I think that's a trend that we need to recognize.
Thank you. Guibourg, books and what do people get wrong?
Perhaps what people get wrong, if that's okay. Alexandra, I completely agree with you. I get the same impression, that pacifist, militarist sort of alternative is really what I see in the French media as well. Another one I see in the same vein is Japan being portrayed as conservative or nationalist. That was particularly the case with Abe Shinzo, but there's still a bit of that. And then books, well, I listed a few. There's one that was published recently called Japan's Asian Diplomacy, Power Transition, Domestic Politics, and Diffusion of Ideas. So I tried to identify books that had been published fairly recently and in English. This one is by Hidetaka Yoshimatsu. I also thought, since Makoto Yokibe passed away recently, I'd mention his translation by Robert Eldridge of the Diplomatic History of Post-War Japan. That's 2013. That was published by Routledge. But Iyokibe Makoto really, is a bit of a well-known figure of Japan's international relations scene. I thought of mentioning maybe Shinoda Tomohito, and I like several of his books, actually, but I'll just mention, I believe, what is the latest one to have been published in English, Contemporary Japanese Politics. I really, really enjoyed reading Takenaka Harukata's book on failed democratization in pre-war Japan, so nothing to do with what we talked about today. This is a book published by Stanford University Press in 2014. I was inspired by his work, actually, in my 2022 academic work, because it really shows the roots of Japanese democracy to date back to pre-war Japan. And I think, if you don't fail to understand that, then you miss a great part of the story.
Thank you, Guibourg. And Yoko-san.
I was also going to mention Iyokibe Makoto, who passed away very surprisingly in March. I mean, it feels like yesterday. I was kind of shocked to find out that already more than 2 months have passed since then. Many books by him has been translated to English. But one thing he was feeling passionate about was earthquake, actually. He's written a lot of books on diplomatic history, which has been translated in English. I found that the era of great disasters, Japan and its 3 major earthquakes, has also been translated in English. He personally experienced the Kobe earthquake, and he said that really changed his life. I think this is also worth looking at, how natural disasters still keeps affecting Japan's life. For that matter, Robert, you said we can also mention films. I would mention Godzilla. And there's so many different versions of Godzilla. The one that won the Academy Awards visual effect was Godzilla minus 0.1. Personally, I am more in favor of Shin Godzilla 2016, which has allusions to Fukushima as well. So there again, you have earthquake and war and nuclear power kind of combined in Japanese psyche. Another book, actually, I thought I should mention a book written by a European and a Polish lady, Beata Bohorodicz, Fukushima and civil society, the Japanese anti-nuclear movement from a socio-political perspective. So there we are, everything combined and somehow tied to earthquakes. I didn't consciously do that, but it's so much part of our life, earthquakes. Every day you watch the TV, and usually there's something about earthquake. Whether it's the recent one or the one in Fukushima or the one in Kobe, every day there's something about earthquakes. And you ask the self-defense force people, and the two things they think about is, of course, contingency in the South Sea, but also the Great Tokyo earthquake. Every day they wake up and hope that this is not the day. So that's forever present in our mind. Okay. So what do you think people get wrong about Japan? I mean, very similar to what the two ladies said. The question I get most when I talk about national security in Japan is about Article 9 Constitution. Is Japan going to change that? The short answer is no. But the longer answer is it has been changing. So this is very difficult to understand. This combination of obstinacy and flexibility of Japanese in dealing with legal and security matters. This is very difficult to understand, and I think both Guibourg and Alexandra would agree about this.
Thank you, Yoko. That's a wonderful way to end, that Article 9 won't change but has been changing. Leave that for our listeners to cogitate on. Which brings us to the end. So thank you very much, Yoko, calling from Japan, and Guibourg in France, and Alexandra in Berlin. Thank you to our fantastic guests for their insights. Please do follow them on X. Their X handles and their details will be on the show notes. Thank you also to our listeners for joining us on another episode of Japan Memo. If you have any comments or feedback, please do contact us on this email, japanchair@iiss.org. If you enjoyed this episode, we urge you to subscribe to Japan Memo on the podcast platform of your choice. And for more insightful analysis, I also encourage you to look at past research by the Japan Chair Programme and by the IISS, which is also on our website. Thank you again, and see you next time.